Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today our show is going to be a discussion of Bobby Fischer, the Sicilian defense, and the d5 square. Traditionally, in many lines of the Sicilian, most notably lines of the Najdorf where black plays e5, and of course the Sveshnikov Sicilian, in both cases, black has a hole on the d5 square, and this can be, this can be a very attractive location for a white knight. And, well, many games have been won in chess history, certainly, with such a powerful, dominant knight. And what I want to do is take a look at Fischer on both sides of the board in positions where he's either fighting for and then trying to exploit this control over this square, and then also cases where he's defending against it, so either trying to stop his opponent from being able to use that as an outpost, or trying in some way or other to combat that. There are actually quite a few games in his career with this theme. I've selected 4. So we'll start off with a pretty easy one. This is against Olicio Gadia, played in Mar del Plata in 1960, and Fischer had white. Okay, so we have the Najdorf Sicilian here. Fischer played his pet line with bishop to c4. Okay, now here black played bishop to b7. This is still a perfectly good move, although I would say bishop to e7 first is generally more common. So bishop to b7. Here I think rook to e1 is now more common than Fischer's choice of f4. And then here in turn, bishop to e7 is a well-known move, and black seems to be doing quite well here. This doesn't seem to be a dangerous line for black any longer. But Gadia played knight to c6, and this is quite rare, although it's not necessarily bad. Fischer continued knight c6, bishop c6, and now f5. And so here we have the first inklings, very clear inklings, of white trying to force e5 and thereby take advantage of the d5 square. Well, black could try to fight against this by playing b4, with the idea that if the knight moves, let's say to a4, well, then he can play e5 and have a reasonable position. This has occurred before, and after bishop to e3, rook to b8, certainly black has no problems here. But a more feisty approach, and one that I'm fairly sure that Fischer would have opted for, is f takes e6. Black doesn't want to take the knight here just yet. He can maybe benefit by throwing in this check first and then grabbing the knight. But all the same, in this position, certainly white has very good compensation for the piece, and well, it's quite messy, but it's a lot easier for white to play than black. However, this didn't even arise in the game as Gadia played e5. And now, well, white can start to take advantage, but not just yet. First he has to protect the e4 pawn, so he plays queen at e3. Okay, so he covers it, and now the plan will be to play bishop to g5, take, and then it'll be that much easier for white to exploit the d5 square. So black really doesn't do anything to combat this. He plays very, very cooperatively. Bishop to e7, bishop to g5. And now here I think a decent move for black that he didn't play in the game was knight to g4. So black is not really going to be terribly upset to trade off the dark squared bishops. I mean, his dark squared bishop is not the most active piece on the board, to put it mildly. While the knight can then return to g4, let's say if there's a swap. The knight can return from g4 back to f6, and again contest the d5 square. So instead black gave check and castled. Okay, so takes, and perhaps his thought was that after knight to d5, bishop takes d5, let's say bishop takes d5, rook c8, that things wouldn't be that bad. One idea could be, well, okay, he's got to be very careful about the king side, but sometimes this bishop can jump over to b6. Another idea might be to play, maybe sometimes with h6 thrown in, the move bishop to g5, and then the bishop can perhaps come here. So you can see various ways in which you can try to activate this piece. And while white's bishop on d5 is a very beautiful piece, no question about it, it's not so obvious how white can really give it enough help. Find some way of seconding the functions of this bishop on d5, namely putting pressure against f7, to really make this count in a big way. So yeah, white's a little bit better here, but it's not that big of a deal. So you can see, for instance, after b4, again, this bishop going maybe to g5, to e3, and then to d4. Black will be quite solid, and only, as I said, probably a little bit worse. But Fischer had a much better idea in mind. He played bishop to d5. So the idea here is to swap off the light squared bishops, and then to have this uncontestable knight on d5. Black's dark squared bishop can't do anything about that. Note, too, that the knight on d5 prevents black from easily activating that bishop, so it can't get to e3, and b6 would be covered as well, and it also supports f5, f6 if that bishop ever moves. So this is a much better way for white to handle the d5 square. Okay, black played rook a to c8, and now he can move the bishop back if given a chance, so of course Fischer captures. Here, probably queen takes c6 is the best move, but Gadea played rook takes, okay, rook a to d1, rook f to c8, knight to d5, and c3. So, no question, white is absolutely better here, but it's not really fatal yet. But here black starts finding some very poor ideas, and the game ends quickly. So he starts with bishop to e7, which may be okay, but giving white the option of playing f5, f6 is, well, it's a dubious idea at best. It's uncomfortable for him to leave the bishop on f6 and to have the queen on d8 stuck defending it, but perhaps that would have been, well, perhaps it's necessary. I don't know if it's, maybe best is the wrong way of putting it. It's pretty hard for black to do anything too constructive here. Okay, well, Fischer plays a very nice move here. He plays rook to a1, preparing to play a2, a4, and after, let's say, an exchange of pawns on the b file, well, of course, there's also pressure against it, but he can also consider following up with moves like rook to a7, adding to the pressure on black's position, really on all parts of the board. I mean, on the queen side, the rook has the a file, the b5 pawn will be weak. In the center, the knight on d5 is beautiful, and the d6 pawn might be weak at some point. And on the king side, with the rook on a7, he has to keep an eye on the f7 square, and always has to beware of f5 to f6. Well, Gadea takes care of all these f5, f6 ideas with f6 for himself, but now the bishop on e7 is just catastrophically bad, plus he's weakening the a2, g8 diagonal. Fischer continues in correct and logical fashion with a2, a4, the whole point of rook a1, and here Gadea makes a natural but very, very, very bad move, rook to b8. And I'm sure you can find out or figure out very quickly for yourself the problem with this move. Knight takes e7 check, and Gadea resigned because after queen takes e7, queen d5 check picks up the rook. Okay, so a very easy game for Fischer, but we can see a very nice, clear plan that he was able to put into practice, and it's one that's very standard. So again, after knight c6, he sees, okay, take, f5, induce the e-pawn up. Okay, we have to take time out to protect the e-pawn. We trade off all of the black defenders of the d5 square. So first the knight, then the bishop, and then the knight will embed itself on d5 with a terrific position. Okay, so that's the first game I wanted to look at. The second game is a more interesting, much richer game, but we see the same plan in action again. So this is Fischer against Bolbochan from the Stockholm Interzonal in 1962. Right, once again it's in Najdorf, but this time Fischer plays a sideline with h3, which he experimented with for a few years and had really good results with too. This is still played sometimes. Carlsen plays it sometimes. Karyakin plays it sometimes. Howell played it against Carlsen unsuccessfully in London, but nevertheless, this does have good results from time to time. Okay, so once again we have this typical Najdorf setup by black with the pawn on e5. And it's not that it's a bad setup by any means, but it does make the possibility, at least, for white to again jump all over the d5 square. Okay, so g5, kicking the knight away, bishop e3. Here, black should probably take on g5. White regains the pawn on d6, and white has an edge here. Okay, in the game, Bolbochan played knight c5, which is probably not best. Here, he should have probably played queen a5, and then followed up with b5, trying to gain some counterplay on the queen side. And white's probably a little bit better, but nothing too terribly serious. All right, instead he castled. Okay, and we won't worry about all of the little fine points, but here we can say that white definitely has a very nice advantage, in part because black has really very little counterplay here. He can't play queen to a5 anymore because of knight to d5, so that old trick where, well, I'll just demonstrate. On queen a5, knight d5, and then if queen takes d2, white has this simple Zwischenzug, knight takes e7 check, king over, rook takes, and white has won a piece. Now that's obvious, but the point is that if black doesn't have queen to a5, it's quite a bit harder for him to achieve any counterplay here. Alright, well he played knight to d7, h4, b5. Okay, so black wants to play b4 here, and or at least play, to build up for this queenside attack. I mean, b4 can be an idea, although it could also weaken his queenside pretty seriously. Another idea is to play knight to b6 and then jump into c4. Maybe play b4 there. Maybe play knight to a4 there. So after knight to b6, black will have a number of options, all of which are aimed, at creating as much play on the queen side as fast as he can. I mean, white's plan on the king side is really clear. He's going to play h5 and then g6. And other moves are lurking around too that I don't want to mention just yet, but that's a very basic plan for white, and it's not too far from becoming a real concern for black. All right, well, let me get rid of this. What should white do in this position? Well, let's think of our thematic topic here, bishop to h3. So once again, Fischer wants to swap off all the light squared goodies that black has, or all the minor pieces that can fight for the light squares, especially d5, and then take it over for his own fiendish purposes. Okay, here if b4, then knight to d5 would be played, and it would be quite strong. If knight to b6, then, well, take, and now, of course, not bishop takes e6. After fe, d5 is then covered, and the rook on f8 hits the f3 pawn. But knight to d5, and here, of course, if bishop d5, there's bishop c8. And on queen to b7, then we can just cash in, and the extra pawn is a very clean one, and white's in great shape. So after bishop to h3, Bolbochan simply took, and then played knight to b6, ready to jump into c4, but of course, takes, knight to d5. And so there once again is that majestic knight on d5, unchallenged, unchallengeable at least. Can't be challenged for a cost lower than the exchange. And black's bishop on e7 is terrible. White's kingside attack is not too far from becoming very dangerous, while black doesn't have a queenside counterattack. So just very quickly the game went like this. Queen to d8, f4. You should notice that white can't cash in. First of all, it's probably not such a great idea for him to cash in because his position is so dominant, but even more to the point, rook f to d8 just wins on the spot. Okay, so f4, and now queen f5. White, once again, is trying to use this little Zwischenschach on e7, so queen f5, knight e7 check, and then white recaptures the queen with an extra piece. So rook c to d8. Now another clever move, rook to a3. Black can't defend the a pawn with the rook because then the queen hangs. You can't trade queens first because, again, knight takes e7 check. So queen a7 is forced, and now rook c3 is very nice, threatening rook to c7, which simply wins. Okay, black played g6, queen g4, queen d7, queen f3. And again, I mean, black just has these permanent problems. I mean, his position is just really, just very miserable here. And now white switches gears, but it's still instructive. So this knight has been just glorious on d5, but white realizes that he can use some other pieces on that square. So he plays knight f4. Black's queen has only one move, and then rook to d5. And now the queen has to fianchetto itself. Queen h8. Fischer just takes time out with a3. No back rank worries. And here Bulbochan tries to break out with h6, but not surprisingly, with all of Fischer's active pieces and extra space, this is just going to help white, though it required some nice tactics to prove it. So takes, queen takes, h5. Okay, if g5, well, once again, there's a gruesome hole that black has to worry about. Knight e2, followed by knight to g3 or knight to d4 and knight f5. So bishop to g5, h takes g6. Okay, so now if bishop takes f4, white takes, and just takes, and can either play rook to f5 check, or I think Soltis recommends rook to h5. Either way, white's in great shape. Maybe this is just, yeah, this looks like an even better move. Okay, so after hg, black can't take the knight, but plays f takes g6. And this looks strong, at least at first glance, because of the pin on the knight on f4, but Fischer has queen to b3, which is what he played. And black is in deep, deep trouble. If he plays king h8, then white can win with simply rook takes g5. If queen takes g5, then queen h3, followed by mate on h7. I guess unless black plays queen h5, which is horrible. Knight takes queen or knight takes g6 would win then. So rook takes f4, queen g3, hitting the rook, threatening rook to h4. And white breaks in. And yeah, okay. So black can still put up some little bit of fight, but ideas like rook d8, rook d7 are winning. White can also just take on a6. So this is terrible for black. Probably even better is knight takes g6 check, queen g6, rook takes g5. So if queen takes, then queen h3 check, and queen h7 mate. Okay, but now, not after king to g8, not queen h7. This is a funny and kind of scandalous moment, let's say, in chess publishing history. So I think Fischer just gives queen takes f1 winning, and some people who thought they should take it upon themselves to improve Fischer's 60 memorable games, and without even noting that they were making a change, they put this as if this was Fischer's analysis. They gave the following line: queen h7 check, king f8, queen h8 check, queen g8, queen h6 check, queen g7, and queen takes g7 mate. I would show you that variation, but the problem is the computer won't let me do it. Why? Because white is in check here. So queen h6 is just illegal, and here white can just resign. He's down a rook for nothing. So both a bit of very sloppy analysis by these publishers, but more than that, I think just ethically really very low thing to do. I really dislike that intensely. Editors are one thing, but a later editor, when the book is already out in print, making a change, putting the words in the author's mouth is not a good thing to do. Anyway, the right move here is queen takes f1, and white is winning. Okay, so that's what could have happened if black had played king h8. In the game, Bulbochan played rook takes f4, and Fischer won nicely with rook to e5 check, discover check, king f8, rook takes e8 check, and here Bulbochan resigned, and the reason is that after king takes, white doesn't play, let's say, queen to g8 check, but throws in queen to e8 check, and it's mate next move. I'm sorry, it can be mate in 2. So if bishop to e7, of course, there's rook c8. If king to d8, then either queen to d7 or queen to c8 or rook to c8 are all mate. And king to f8 lasts the most moves, but makes no difference. Queen c8, and then queen takes d8. Okay, so we've just seen two games where Fischer very nicely, very convincingly took advantage of the d5 square, the weakness there, planted a knight there, and well, basically obtained a really dominating position that he was able to cash in extremely easily in the first case, with more difficulty in the second case, but still he was always very much in charge. Now we're going to take a look at games where he's fighting against plans like this. So the first one, he's black against Milan Matulovic. This was played in Vinkovci in 1968. And once again, lo and behold, we have a Neidorf. And this time we see g3. Okay, e5. And so once again we see the potentially vulnerable d5 square. All right, Matulovic goes back to e2, bishop e7. And now here comes the plan. Bishop to g5. All right, now, of course, the idea is to play bishop takes f6 and hopefully put a knight on the d5 square. Now, there was a little bit of a tactical point here to notice. You might think, well, why doesn't white just play or black just play knight takes e4? Well, knight takes e4, bishop g5, and now knight takes d6 check. Takes and takes, and the black king is not in danger, but after queen to d5, there's that d5 square once again. White is better. Okay, so in the game, instead of knight takes e4, Fischer played knight b to d7, so that way the one knight will replace the other when white plays bishop takes f6. Okay, but now that the knight is on d7, it blocks the bishop on c8, and so white plays bishop to h3. So it's straight out of the old recipe book here. He wants to take on, take the one knight, take the second knight, and have an extra on have extra pieces controlling the d5 square. Okay, well, what should black do here? In an earlier game, black played knight to b6, fighting for the d5 square with the knight. But okay, takes, and now a4. So it's not quite the same. Let's say the plan doesn't finish exactly the same way as it did in the other cases that we looked at, but still it comes to something pretty similar. White gets control over d5. Slowly but surely. Okay, so queen d3, and here Matulovic's opponent in this earlier game played in Reggio Emilia against Stefano Tatai. Black played a5. So a5 didn't happen, but just watch. We'll go through this fairly quickly, but you can see what's going to go on. Now the knight goes to b5, c4, and now you can see that white has this death grip on the d5 square. Very, very inconvenient for black to handle this. And sure enough, lo and behold, there's a knight on d5, and the knight on b5 can always drop back to c3 in case black ever challenges it with his knight on d7, if it ever goes to b6 or f6. So white has a terrific grip on the position, and he went on to win. So this is the sort of thing that Matulovic was no doubt hoping to repeat against Fischer. Okay, well, here's what Fischer did. So he plays b5. So first of all, if bishop takes f6, knight f6, bishop c8, rook c8, it's not quite as easy for white to take over the d5 square. He can play knight to d5, sure, but then we have the exchange, and black isn't so unhappy as long as white doesn't have a knight there. And it's even worse than that, though, for white, because if he recaptures with the queen, the pawn on c2 is hanging. And if he takes with the pawn, well, that just completely lets black off the hook. So this is just no big deal at all, and there's not really any other way for white to get rid of the knight on f6, at least no sane way. I mean, g4 would be a terrible idea here. Black could take the pawn, and black could also even consider b4. Okay, so that doesn't work. So he tried a4, b4. Now, another idea for Matulovic could be to play bishop takes d7, again hoping to take on f6 next and drop the knight in on d5. But against this, black can play queen takes d7, and now on bishop f6 play b takes c3, and black is doing very well here. If bishop takes g7, then simply rook to g8, and then we take the b2 pawn next. And on bishop takes e7, well, once again we take the pawn. And here, okay, material has been reestablished, but black has no problems whatsoever. Much better pawn structure, superior minor piece, kind of ahead in development as well. And white is not going to be able to get his knight on d5, so the black bishop can always contest it. Anyway, this is a very bad position for white. Okay, so bishop takes d7 doesn't work. So Matulovic played knight to d5. Okay, takes, hitting the rook, and now rook to b8. Well, Matulovic still had some small hopes here, so he played bishop takes e7, and now perhaps hoped that on queen takes he could play rook to d1, a5, and now if black plays knight to f6, then queen a8 just wins. The bishop is attacked twice, and the rook on b6 is hanging. So rook to b5, but then white can capture this pawn. Black has a little bit of compensation. Well, actually, that's not really the right way to put it, because he can regain the pawn, but white's active rook here gives him an edge. So it looks as if, while Fischer has found a way to fight against the meaningful control over the d5 square by white, it came at a cost. But, as we'll see, this is not the case. Fischer plays king takes e7. And now the d6 pawn is just fine. There's just no problems with it at all. Black threatens to play knight to b6 or knight to f6, attacking the queen and discovering an attack on the bishop. So let me indicate this. See, with the king not on e8, there's no queen c6 check rejoinder. And also bishop to b7 is coming. Black has no problems whatsoever. So he's got a great structure. The white knight on e2 is absolutely dominated. It can't go anywhere forward. It can't go to c3, can't go to d4, can't go to f4, and it's never going to get to d5, or at least not for a long, long, long time. So here's how the game went. Queen d2, knight f6. Okay, if white trades, then the e4 pawn is hanging, and after f3, queen c5 is very nice for black. So bishop to g2, and we can just see Fischer building very nicely in the position. Okay, so here black is seriously better. Neither white minor piece is very good. Black has pressure against e4. He has more space. He's going to have pressure on the c file. Has complete control over the dark squares. And moves like bishop to a6 are coming too. So he's going to have control over both sets of squares. And now h5. So keeping Matulovic bottled up. He's not going to get g4, g5, knight g3, knight f5 in. Nothing like that. Not even close. Okay, so b3, this is another really ugly move. It stops rook to c4, ganging up on the e4 pawn, but of course now c3 is a hole. And Fischer immediately exploits this. Takes, and rook c3. And now, okay, d5 looks like a hole still, but there's absolutely nothing that white can do there. Black's knight covers it. The white bishop on g2 is dreadful. You know, if we could just pick it up and put it on c4, maybe white's position wouldn't be completely horrible, but we can't. Also, white has to deal with the threat of rook takes g3 right now. So plays rook to d3, and again rook takes g3 is threatened, so the king moves. And now white has terrible problems with the c2 pawn. He can't play rook to c1 because then he drops the b3 pawn to the pin. So rook a2, and now Fischer just does a little consolidating and then moves in for the kill. So g6, protecting the h pawn, and a little more centralization. And after f3, a little more centralization. And really, white can just resign in this position. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. But he continues. And, okay, black's up one pawn. Now it's two pawns. And still Matulovic plays for some unknown reason. And here they made the time control, but Fischer I don't think wasn't in time trouble in this game. So maybe Matulovic was too short of time to resign. Anyway, here they made the time control. The game was adjourned, and Matulovic actually waited several days before throwing in the towel. So I don't know if the two of them had some some bad blood, but not really good behavior on Matulovic's part. Anyway, a beautiful game by Fischer that shows how to fight against such a plan. All right, well, now let's take a look at still another game where Fischer had black and had to deal with this plan to exploit the d5 square. So this is from the Sousse interzonal. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. The interzonal in 1967 in Tunisia that Fischer was leading with a big score but withdrew from. Okay, so white in this game is Robert Byrne, very strong American grandmaster who made it to the candidates 2 cycles later in 1973 and almost made it again in 76. So Byrne, I guess in a bit of a cheeky mood, plays bishop to c4, Fischer's favorite line, against him, and comes to find that Fischer knows how to face it as well. Okay, nowadays castling here's the main move, or certainly a main move. Bishop to g5 is also quite common, as is queen to f3. But he played f4, and this is really not the most dangerous plan. But it's a very consistent plan, and it's just as in the games that we saw where Fischer had white. Okay, again, the game with Gadea, he's trying to force the weakness of the d5 square. So, sure enough, Fischer plays e5. Okay, knight d to e2, knight b to d7. So once again, we have bishop to g5 now, bishop e7, and now knight to g3. And this is a good moment to try to figure out what you would do if you were black. So white's idea here is to play knight h5 and just go swapping everything. So he'd like to play, for instance, something like bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, knight h5. Let's say black castles. And then we play knight f6, bishop f6, and then bishop to d5. So that's the idea. So just to give a variation. So castles, takes, knight h5. All right, now black can't get away with knight e4 because takes, and queen g4 with a double attack. So hitting here and hitting here. Maybe it doesn't lose outright because black can play g6, but black's position is still pretty bad. So knight h5, queen h5. And again, if black does nothing really too serious, bishop to d5 is going to be played. Remember, not knight to d5, but bishop d5. We want to be left with the good knight versus the bad bishop. And in fact, even if black plays rook to c8, white can still do that. And here, white has very real compensation for the pawn. The fantastic knight, black's bad bishop, the possibility of ideas like f6, or in some cases maybe some kind of rook lift, going to g3 or h3, and black has quite a bit to be worried about here. This would be a nice position for Byrne, and this is undoubtedly the sort of thing he had in mind after playing this system and playing knight to g3. But Fischer found a very, very nice way to defang it, and you might, as I said, you might want to try to figure it out for yourself. Okay, well, he starts with the move rook to c8. And this is a good move. Let's see what happens if white tries to execute the standard plan. Bishop takes f6, knight f6, knight h5, and now the point, rook takes c3. Okay, if b takes c3, then knight takes e4 is very good. And, okay, if knight f6, bishop f6, and then taking, well, bishop takes e4. And again, black is better here. He's down the exchange for a pawn, which is obviously a material deficit, but a very, very small one. He's also threatening the pawns on g2 and on f5. He's got the bishop pair. This bishop on e4 is fantastic. He's also intending to play d5 when this bishop on b3 is just shut out of the game. It's locked in. So clearly, if you compare the value of those two bishops, black comes out way ahead. So this would be a superior position for black. So instead of playing bishop f6 straight away, Byrne castled, hoping to execute this plan at a more propitious moment. Notice that the rook on f1 after castling, white is covering both the g2 pawn with his king and the f5 pawn with his rook. So I bring this up again in the context of this variation. Right, so here those two pawns are threatened, so if white has the problem for white is that there are three threats. There's bishop takes g2, there's bishop takes f5, and there's d6 to d5, the pawn push. Well, if he's already castled, he can simply play a move like bishop to d5, and then he's in pretty good shape. So that's what castling is intended to take care of. So that if black were to castle, then white would play bishop f6, knight h5, and so on. Okay, so what does black do? Well, here's the brilliant idea that put this line completely out of business. h5. And in the game since then, when white has gone down this route and black has remembered to play h5, black has something like a 90% score in the databases. It really busts white's plan completely. So now, of course, the knight is not getting to h5. So that means that white is not going to be able to swap everything off and grab the d5 square. But it's worse than that because black is positively threatening to play h5 to h4 and then take advantage of the weak pawn on e4. So it's both a prophylactic move, defending against white's plan, and it's an aggressive one. It's got its own agenda. All right, and there's also b4 in some cases to worry about too. So this is also in play. Again, not only fighting for d5, but for this pawn on e4 as well. So white, in fact, played h4 to stop black from doing the same, and now here it is, b4. Okay, white played bishop takes f6, still hoping to fight for the d5 square as best as possible. Even if he can't wind up with a glorious knight there, he'd like to end up with some minor piece there, and hope to be able to use the extra space he's got in the center. But Fischer is a bit too sharp for Byrne on this occasion. So he plays bishop takes f6, not the stereotypical knight takes f6. So here, white plays knight to d5, sure enough, but now there's some kingside problems for Byrne to worry about after bishop takes h4. Well, he's just down a pawn with a lousy game if he doesn't take, but now white has to worry about the open h file, and black can definitely exploit it. Fischer played queen to g5, and this is certainly good enough, but maybe even better is bishop takes d5. Then queen to b6 check, driving the white king to the h file. And here, white is hoping he can save himself with the threat of queen takes f7 check. So rook takes h5 isn't a problem because of the check, and then white picking it up. But black has a nice move here, knight f6. And after queen takes f7, king d8, white's attack, maybe attack in scare quotes, is over, and meanwhile he's got to defend his knight on h5, and to do so in a way that doesn't just allow a mate on the h-file. So probably g4 is the best try, but here black has many good moves, of which queen to e3 is just one of them, but it's a very effective one, threatening queen h3 and then queen takes g4, both with check. Also queen takes e4 is a nasty possibility. White's just dead lost here. So this would have been even more effective, but what Fischer did was just fine as well. Queen to g5, threatening the knight. Okay, Byrne tries to save himself with some tactical tricks here with f6, but Fischer will have none of it. He just plays g6, check, king over, and the threat is to play bishop to g3, followed by the stock combination rook h1, then queen h4 and queen h2 mate. So white played rook to f3, queen to d3. But black still has too much attack. Bishop h2, knight to c5, and here, okay, if the queen goes to e3, then bishop to f4 not only hits the queen, but has the idea of rook to h1, and on queen to g1, black has, well, no shortage of good moves. One of them is bishop to c1, but there's lots of good moves here. I mean, it's really just target practice at this point. Okay, so Byrne played rook to h3, shutting the h-file. Rook to h4, queen f3, and now Fischer just liquidates some material and ends up with a completely winning position. Queen takes f6, king here, and now he could take on g7, be a pawn or two up, but he has a much more efficient way of finishing the game. Queen f4, and here Byrne resigned. The threat is bishop to g3 check, and as you can no doubt quickly confirm for yourself, white really has no good defense to this idea. So the point is that on After bishop g3 check, if king e2, rook takes c2 check, forces mate, I think, next move. And if the king goes to d1 instead, then queen f1 check is very strong. And maybe there's probably something just as good as that too, but that's certainly good enough. So in this lost position, down a pawn, under terrific attack with a bad knight as well in g7, Byrne reside. Okay, so I hope this was both entertaining and instructive. I think definitely seeing Fischer's very clear, logical play in all four of these games is, his chess is really just beautiful. I mean, at its best, again, the games were, these beautiful blends of strategic plans being put very logically and clearly and consistently into practice, with tactical elements featuring, always in an important way, but very elegantly. I mean, always fitting the strategic needs of the position. And so I think because of that, I mean, it's just a very attractive player to study. And we see just how clearly he was able to outplay maybe I should say three very strong opponents. Gadea was not in the same class as these other guys, but yeah, I mean, Byrne was a very strong grandmaster, and Matulovic was a good GM as well, and Bulbachan was, I believe, an IM, perfectly decent player, and yet it was basically Fischer doing what he wanted to, exerting his will on the position. So entertaining, beautiful, but again, I hope instructive. So you see, the importance of the d5 square. That it's certainly one of the key battlegrounds in many Najdorfs, and again, not only Najdorfs, but the Najdorf certainly is what we saw here today. And again, if white can grab the square, can dominate on that square, it can be extremely effective, but black is certainly not powerless against these plans. All right, so I'll go ahead and close there. Thank you very much, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.